All right, guys, got a great interview I wanted to share with you today. It's Andrew Ross Sorkin. He's an anchor from CNBC. He's interviewing Scott Bessent at some economic forum. Now, the thing about Scott Bessent that's super interesting is that he's works for Trump. He's a member of MAGA now, and he's gay. He's married, and he has adopted children. I for the most part, just that alone disqualifies you from being a serious person on the MAGA stage just because of those things. In addition to that, he also worked with George Soros in the 90s. So he also worked with one of the number one enemies of MAGA. So that's three strikes, and the guy still gets to be in the job. Why does he get to be in the job? Well, so Bessent is very experienced in the economy and hedge funds and just financial stuff. So he knows what he's talking about, and he has loads of credibility. Now, when it comes to being the Trump's Treasury Secretary, every position he had before Donald Trump, before this position, he has reneged on. Um, he's just constantly just put in a tough spot because Trump is making really bad decisions on the economy, arguably bad decisions, and Scott Bessent, who just knows better, he knows better about all these things. He's still carrying water for Trump, and watching him squirm and try to change definitions of meaning of words, try to reframe questions so that he could get out of it when he knows that all of his answers, they're not good. Like, the economy doesn't look good. It's not heading in the right direction. Everybody knows this. Even people who aren't involved in politics knows damn well that the economy is not doing well, and it's not going in a good direction either. And it's mainly because of the new policies that Trump has made. And don't get it twisted. It's not the government's made. Trump's made it. None of this stuff has gone through Congress. It's all Trump just making executive orders and doing what he can from his desk, making everything just dubiously legal. But either way, this interview is really good, and he just some very very interesting questions asked of him, and his answers are illuminating, to say the least. So let's dig in, see what we get here.
Andrew Ross Sorkin and his guest, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
The 79th Treasury Secretary of the United States is here, Scott Bessent. He is, of course, at the center of all of the major policy decisions of the moment. And we're going to cover them all. We're going to talk about the economy, affordability, global trade, national security, the future of the Fed, and so much more. I want to welcome you to DealBook. Thank you.
Andrew, great to be here.
I'll tell you where I want to start. I want to start this conversation and talk to you about tariffs, because I think almost singularly, it's the biggest shift in the United States and really the global economy. And it's a philosophical choice and a practical shift. And I want to understand your thinking. And I'll tell you why I want to understand your thinking about this, because when I went back and was really looking at sort of how your own thinking has evolved, it clearly is different today than it was before you were the Treasury Secretary. So back in 2024, this is long before Trump had won. By the way, you had predicted he was going to win. And this is long before you were the Treasury Secretary. You wrote an investor letter while running Keybridge. And you wrote the following: one of your differentiated views that we have is that Trump will pursue a weak dollar policy rather than implementing tariffs. Tariffs are inflationary, you said, and would strengthen the dollar, hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance. And
He said tariffs are inflationary. His answer here is probably going to be interesting.
that, and I thought to myself, help us just understand your own thinking on this issue.
Well, and Andrew, that I think a big part of my investment career, and to the extent I was successful, was being able to evolve my thinking. And I believe that what we've seen, and I have to say that President Trump has been right on this, that he told me early on, he said, Scott, the United States is like a department store. Everyone wants to shop here, and only the United States can do what we're about to do. And I watched.
That makes no sense at all. We are not a department store. That is,
As the leader, or nation after nation, trade negotiator after trade negotiator, leader after leader, President Trump has normalized the idea of a 15 to 20% tariff. And I think what goes, everyone likes the hysteria of prices and this and that, but what has gone unnoticed is USTR Jameson Greer with President Trump's support, has done an incredible job of dropping the non-tariff trade barriers and the tariffs from other countries. So when you see this deal and you say, well, Indonesia has agreed to, and by the way, Indonesia is getting a little recalcitrant here, but a good actor, Malaysia, has agreed to do this. They might have dropped 8,000 lines of tariffs. So U.S. business, it's actually flowing much better.
Would you say you're surprised then? If
What the hell was that word salad of an answer?
that's true, would you say, given where you were 2 years ago and where you are now on this issue, would you say, I got it wrong, I missed something?
I think, look, again, I've had an open mind, and that I've evolved on this, and that the president's been right. And the president has I've said it publicly, the president has a much higher risk appetite than I do. And my evolution went to, well, I think we should do smaller incremental tariffs. And the president went in with a maximalist position, and that is actually what gave us the leverage in the negotiations by saying, okay, you've got a 35% tariff. When Japan agrees to a 15% tariff, it's similar.
I just want to point out there's no deals. He's gonna go into like these deals that we did with other countries. There's no deals. We didn't change anything. All we did was raise tariffs on countries. We didn't make any trade deals. This is BS, and he knows it, but he's trying his best.
So thank you.
Why has there been such a reticence for the administration to say, you know what? We're going after these tariffs. We think they're bringing in a lot of revenue. We think it's good for labor. And you know what? It might have an inflationary impact, and we're cool with that.
No, Andrew, first of all, I think, in your mind, what's inflation?
Well, I think anytime you see prices move up beyond the sort of standard, if you will, and I don't know what the standard you think should be, but anytime that
This is classic. Try to redefine what a word means. Classic MAGA debate tactic.
a period of time where there are artificial things happening that are effectively pressing prices up.
Well, you could get a one-time price adjustment. Inflation is a generalized price and persistent price increase. So there's a big difference. That this hasn't set off some inflationary mindset. And the other thing too that I missed, but I saw early on in the negotiations, is that China is a very different economic animal, and they are willing to subsidize labor, subsidize production, subsidize capital. And because of that, they depend on this export economy. And I think if you were to look, the Chinese have consistently, on the Chinese portion of the imports, the Chinese have consistently cut prices.
But you don't look. I mean, this is
that I don't believe tariffs are a tax, but I was surprised. I got a couple of the Democrats to step into the bear trap. They said, "Well, tariffs are a tax." They said, "Okay, so you believe tariffs are a tax?" Yes. You believe tariffs are inflationary? Yes. So you believe taxes are inflationary? So join me and cut taxes, and that will be disinflationary.
No. That doesn't track. Absolutely, that does not track.
But then that's an acknowledgement that it's some degree.
So you're acknowledging that tariffs are taxes? That's actually what I think. That's what Andrew's going to get into right now. He just acknowledged that tariffs are taxes. His point that if you raise taxes, then that's inflationary. What you just did was admit that tariffs are taxes. So you raise taxes, dog.
It's a tax.
No. But I'm just parroting what they say. We could give a 5% tax. We could reduce, according to that logic, we could reduce inflation across the country by cutting the sales tax 5%, right?
Look, I understand. This is Bank of America. They say we think there's no debate. Tariffs have pushed consumer prices higher. Jay Powell, who I know you're not a fan of, who was here last year, said inflation away from tariffs is actually not so far from our 2% goal. But of course, he's saying it's away from tariffs. And so the tariff piece clearly.
But the tariff piece is a small part of the economy. You're in this fever swamp of Democratic talking points. And by the way, a huge number of the Democrats, they are in favor of tariffs.
No,
they just can't say it now because they can't deviate from the hive.
No.
I think if you were to go back and look at Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders,
Democrats are in favor of tariffs, but not like we could put a tariff on like steel from China or like lumber from Canada so that we end up buying it here. But we don't nobody's rooting for is going for blanket tariffs where nobody's doing that. Only Donald Trump is, and this guy knows it's wrong, but he's trying to defend it right now.
So now, because it's the Trump tariffs, they got to be against it.
Okay, let me ask you a different question then, which is there is going to be a ruling. We're going to hear from the Supreme Court at some point soon, likely, about tariffs. If, in fact, they strike them down or push them back, and I'm just curious what kind of planning you've been doing, what you think the different permutations are that this could take.
A couple of things, Andrew, is I can tell you I was not in the same hearing that the New York Times and the mainstream media was in. It was a completely the report.
Okay, tell me what you heard then.
The reporting was the hearing was very different, very different. When Amy Coney Barrett said that if we undo this, it'll be a mess, it was taken as it'll be a mess. She actually meant it as we better be very judicious, which I assume the Supreme Court would be, but they better be very prudent about doing this, right? And I just saw that Costco is going to file for a refund. Okay, tell me what kind of refund Costco's due if the foreign producer lowered their price. They've taken a deduction.
Right.
They've taken a deduction on having paid the tariffs. So, and I
Nobody lowered any price, and deduction for tariffs. So you still have to pay the tariffs up front, and then you get a tax deduction later in the year. It hasn't even been a year, so we don't even know if we're going to get those deductions yet. And also, like, Costco doesn't pay the tariffs. They raise the price on their things because they had to pay the tariffs to get it, and then we pay it. The consumer pays it, not the company. The company probably pays some of it, at least up front, but the consumer inevitably pays it.
I'm optimistic on this. Everyone says it'll be a loss for the administration. I think it'll be a loss for the American people. And
but if you lose, what do you do?
But the ultimate goal here, that the revenue, and I have been very consistent on this, that tariffs are a shrinking ice cube. The ultimate goal is to rebalance trade and to bring back domestic production.
Okay, let me ask you a separate.
And to finish, that the IEPA authority, and if anyone listened or looked at the transcript, that it was kind of the neo-theater of the absurd, because the plaintiff said, and I can't remember whether it was Justice Alito, I think it was Justice Alito, said, so you believe that the President of the United States has the right to put on an embargo, but not a 1% tariff? And he said, yes. But look, we can recreate the exact tariff structure with 301s, with 232s, with I think they're called 122s.
But not permanently.
Permanently.
You think
well, the 122s aren't permanently. But
what he's saying is the president doesn't need Congress to raise tariffs. That's essentially what he's saying.
The others, we can do it. The IEPA authority gave the president and our team much more negotiating room. And let me tell you, there were plenty of other times, and I said it several times, if IEPA is an emergency power, if the fentanyl crisis wasn't an emergency power or an emergency, then what was? Now, because of the fentanyl tariffs, the Chinese are making the step forward.
There's no fentanyl tariff either.
I don't know when fentanyl came on the scene.
This guy is just lying out of his
effort
fucking
to
teeth.
do that. That on October 8th, when the Chinese announced that every product in the world that had a 0.01% rare earth Chinese content needed a license, President Trump was able to threaten them with a 100% tariff. They immediately came to the negotiating table. That's emergency authority.
I want to talk about
None
China
of
in a
that
second. I want to
happened.
ask you one final question on the tariff piece, which is
None of
the
that
president
happened.
said last week that potentially, given the amount of money being brought in as a function of tariffs, and this goes to the tax issue, that he believes he could ultimately lower the income tax over the next several years. Are you planning to do that?
We'll have to wait on the ruling.
And that's dependent on the ruling. But you're saying if you get
Andrew, we'll see where it goes.
Okay. Let me pivot here to the Federal Reserve, if I could, because Kevin Hassett is now said to be the front runner. I think Shane Complin might be here from Polymarket this morning. Polymarket's odds right now have him at 70%. Can you give us any insight as to whether Hassett's either getting this job, but perhaps even more importantly, how much you think it matters that the Fed chair appear to be independent from the president?
A lot to unpack there.
Not at all.
So I will point out
Not at
that
all.
during
That is
the
gonna be his
contest
answer.
for Treasury Secretary, I was at 80, then I was at 16, then it went to 100. So Polymarket is only as good as the informational inputs.
We'll find Shane up here somewhere, but keep going.
So you can't in the efficient market hypothesis, it's assumed that everyone has perfect information, and in this you can't. Like, I have asymmetric information, and I think the important thing to remember here is that it's a board, and then several other voters from the regional banks. So the chair of the Federal Reserve has the ability to move and start the discussion, but at the end of the day, he or she cannot. He or she is one vote.
But you, I believe, have and we were talking about this last week, you have a larger problem with the broader Fed construct today and the way even Fed presidents from the regional banks are selected.
Well, there are a couple of things. I think that the Fed, as it's used to be known, the creature from Jekyll Island, that has become this creature that the Fed doesn't understand itself. That when you think about how can they set monetary policy, inflation, jobs policy, it has gone from an monetary interest rate function. Now there's a balance sheet function, which I can tell you no one understands. They've gone to an ample reserve, the corridor, that I think some of the volatility we saw in November was the ample reserve corridor being tested. And then there's a regulatory component. So it's become this very complicated calculus. It's not just rates up, rates down.
And so let's talk about this president issue, because I think that part of what you've been talking about is that the regional presidents you think actually are not.
So he asked him, should the president have control over the Fed? He just blabbered about what the Fed does, essentially. Didn't say anything about the relationship between the president and the Fed.
As independent unto themselves that you want.
Well, no, I think when I was on Squawk Box last week, Becky said, well, Susan Collins at the Boston Fed says this. And, that her people in her district are having an affordability problem. I should have said, well, she's in a red state, affordability is worse. In a blue state, affordability is worse than a blue state.
Really?
We can debate that, but keep going.
No, there's no
really?
The number 50 basis points higher inflation, the 10 highest, the inflation rates, they are in blue cities, but
Just so you know, because I went to look at this. This is the Joint Economic Committee, since 2021. The highest inflation over the past 4 years has been in red states, especially Florida.
I'm talking about current.
Not over the past 4 years.
Right. Today.
Okay. I would think 4 years would be a reasonable trend line.
The audience is literally laughing at you right now, Scott, because of what you said is dumb and idiotic. You're a joke. Like, people are laughing at you, literally. You're a literal joke.
Look at
today it is 50 basis points higher. So
50 basis points?
Look,
what are you talking about?
With their feet. I have the American people on my side. That New York, Illinois, California, Massachusetts are depopulating.
And they're going to places in Florida, like Florida, where interest rates inflation's up 22% over the last 4 years.
Well, inflation is up 25% nationally, so it's lower.
I believe in New York it was 19%.
Sorry?
I believe in New York it was 19%.
I think that's right.
We can
brutal,
go.
Dude, brutal. This is what's so great about this is that guys like Scott Bessent and Kevin Hassett and that Jameson guy, Greer guy, they go on CNN, they go on Fox News, and they spit a bunch of bullshit, a bunch of stuff that isn't true. The numbers are wrong. They just made it up, and they just get to fly with it. Right now, he just got fact-checked in real time, and it looks really bad for the Treasury Secretary right now.
But to come back, I do believe that there is now a disconnect from the original framing with the Federal Reserve, that the Federal Reserve presidents in the regional banks were meant to be from their district. And now there's this idea of importing a bright, shiny object, and 3 of the Federal Reserve members, for the regional banks, 2 of them used to work at the New York Fed. One of them was on a committee at the New York Fed, was in a New York investment bank. So do they represent their district? So I am going to start advocating going forward, not retroactively, that regional Fed presidents must have lived in their district for at least 3 years.
Is that a rule that you plan to put in place? Can you put that in place, or is that something the Fed would have to do?
I think that we can. It may be Congress. It may be
Congress
the
ain't
Fed
doing
has
that,
final,
dog.
the Fed, the chair, and the board have final say on who the regional bank bank boards can select.
Right.
So I believe that you would just say, unless someone's lived in the district for 3 years, we're going to veto them.
Okay, let me pivot to the economy and a watchword, which has been the word of the day, affordability. The president called the word affordability a con job yesterday. I'm curious what you think of the idea of affordability and where you think we are in the economic cycle. This is Jamie Dimon back in last month. He said the lower income wages haven't gone up for a long period of time. He did not call the economy recessionary, but weakening. Do you think it's weakening right now?
I think that certain sectors are, and maybe it goes back to the reason we need interest rate cuts. That clearly housing has weakened, and that I believe that, again, the Fed doesn't.
Here's like when I listen to him talking, I say something like, how's it be better if we just have lower interest rates? The reason why I'm not buying a house right now is not because I can only get like 7 or 8% financing right now, which is absolutely unacceptable. Because I know people that got like 2% pre-COVID. It's the fact that the house that pre-COVID that was worth $500,000 is now selling for $1 million. Like I just can't justify that. So the interest rate on that that's not the issue. And every time I hear a financial issue and I hear a Republican give his solution, like the solutions are all that shit ain't gonna work. So that's like it's just disheartening that's what they think is gonna help things.
Really understand this calculus of we've had balance sheet roll off, which is tightening. We have had the 2 rate cuts. But I am very optimistic about the economy next year. We've had a 15% growth in CapEx, and historically, CapEx is always followed by employment growth.
You mentioned China. I want to discuss China for a moment, which is there is a deal, or we're working towards a deal in place. Part of the deal, the most recent deal, was that China was supposed to buy 12 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans. As of just about a week or two ago, they had only bought 330,000 by the end of this year.
No, by the end of the season. So I think that'll be February 28th.
So, okay, we're still at 300. If we're, 330,000.
I promise you, you can try to stir it up. They are in a perfect cadence to complete that goal.
But 330,000.
No. Again, bad information.
Bad information.
Bad information.
They're laughing at you again, Scott. You're an idiot. Like literally, like proof, evidence, facts are put right in front of your face, and you're just like, no. Let me tell you how it actually is.
If I look at the loadings, then their purchase by their central government is well into the correct cadence.
Okay,
so,
let me ask you then a different question.
And I will say that China is on track to keep every part of the deal. Every part of the deal.
We're going to show you an interview a little bit later today with the president of Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is very, very worried right now about the possibility of China invading. They just announced a plan to spend a lot more on their military. I'm curious right now whether you believe that if China were to invade Taiwan, whether the U.S., given its strategic ambiguity policy, would come to the rescue.
I don't answer hypotheticals.
That's a good way to stop us in our tracks. But how should the folks in Taiwan think about the relationship then?
They should think that it's unchanged.
And what does that mean?
That we are in a very good equilibrium, and that you are starting with this, well, what if China invades tomorrow? I have found that since I've come on this side, my least favorite word in journalism is could. Because when a journalist has no story, said, well, they could. So
but that's why Taiwan's spending all the money that they are. That's why they're wringing their hands. They're worried about something that could happen. And they don't know whether we are really an ally of theirs or not.
The United States is an ally of China. The relationship remains unchanged.
Of China, not Taiwan.
Sorry?
You said of China. Just want to
and Taiwan.
And Taiwan. Okay.
The relationship remains unchanged.
Let me ask you a separate question.
That's rough. If you're Taiwan right now, you're watching that and you're like, so we are allies, but you're kind of saying that we're under China's control. Is that what you're saying? Because that's kind of how that came off.
which is about a lot of the big investments. We've been hearing over the last couple of months the president announcing a huge number of transactions with countries like Saudi Arabia and others that plan to invest in the United States. MBS was at the White House, said he was going to spend $1 trillion. And I'm curious if you could just help us understand the scale and size of these investments and how realistic they are. And I say that because $1 trillion happens to be basically nearly the entirety of the GDP of Saudi Arabia. And so how long?
That's an interesting factoid you got, though, Sorkin. Here's the thing: is when I hear about the trade deals and the investments and stuff like that, like basically it's like they're at a press conference with the leaders of that country, and they're like, "Yeah, we're going to invest $1 billion in your country," and it's just like, what does that mean? What do you mean invest $1 billion? Like over, like you're going to spend $1 billion tomorrow? Or like over the next year, and what invest in what? Like that is the most vague just thing that just doesn't sound like it means anything. And then when you put, research and facts behind it, Sorkin's just going to absolutely demolish that Saudi Arabia pledge right now.
If the GDP of Saudi Arabia is $1.3 trillion and they're pledging $1 trillion to us, how that works in practice?
Well, I think that we can see a cadence.
Yeah, Scott. How does that work? If a country pledges all their money to the United States in an investment, how does that work?
It's developing. I was back in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, and the Boeing plant is there. The Dreamliner is expanding by 50% because of the foreign investment that, as part of the trade deals, we have negotiated, President Trump has negotiated 1,000 new Boeing airplanes. So we are getting into this cadence that with pharmaceutical reshoring, with semiconductors, Apple has said that they are going to, I think we're up to $600 billion.
What is he talking about?
I think that we have set the stage and we have these commitments, and those commitments are due to
bring him back, Andrew. Bring him back to the question, please. He's filibustering.
Regulation.
But you think? I guess my question is, the administration has talked about $21 trillion. In investment being made in the U.S. This is according to Bloomberg, so you can go after them if you want to go after them. They say over a review of the 137 projects on the White House's webpage, they believe there's only $7 trillion in pledges that could be considered real investment.
Well, first of all, let's go back to that.
Okay.
Only $7 trillion. Say that again.
By the way, I'm not dismissing $7 trillion. $7 trillion is extraordinary.
But let's go back.
Let's give you credit for it. The question is
only $7 trillion. What was the entire FDI during the Biden administration?
I'm not going to tell you that this is not extraordinary. The question is whether the public is being told the right amount.
Well, the thing is, again, we have asymmetric information.
Right.
We know which companies have committed to reshore production as part of that. We arrived, and back to the China relationship, that I always say we do not want to decouple. We want to de-risk.
Right.
And everyone who was in the administration the past 4 years should be ashamed because they did nothing to de-risk. So whether it's semiconductors, and I will tell you, back to Taiwan, the
CHIPS
single
Act.
greatest
Put
economic
money into
threat is that
semiconductors.
the single point of
Nice
failure
try, dog.
for the global economy would be the disruption on chips from the island of Taiwan.
Yeah, that's why we passed the
more or less
CHIPS Act.
valuable strategically
That's why Biden
to
passed
us
it.
and the rest of the world,
And not you,
as
and not Trump.
we move more of that manufacturing onshore. Meaning, the president says he wants to have 50% of all manufacturing of chips in the U.S. here in the next 2 years. If that were to happen, does that make it more likely that China could go effectively take over Taiwan without us getting involved in? Because we'd say, we've got the chips, we're okay? Or does that make it more likely that we would go protect them?
Well, I think that's like a flawed question because it's like saying that if I have insurance, do I want my house to catch on? Is my house more or less likely to catch on fire? Right? Because you're de-risking, doesn't mean you've changed anything.
These analogies and stuff are terrible.
Larry Fink and Brian Armstrong out here in just a moment. We're going to talk about the markets and everything else. One of the big questions in the marketplace right now is private credit. There's a great worry that perhaps private credit is, as Jeffrey Gundlach has described it, garbage lending. Howard Marks is saying cockroaches in the coal mine, that if there's a crisis in the future, this is where it's going to come from. What do you think?
I think that if we think about the framing of private credit, first of all, let's ask, why have we seen this growth in private credit? The growth in private credit, in my view, is because the regulatory framework for the regulated banking system has been too tight. So at Treasury, I lead something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and we have been working with the regulators to create more credit in the regulated banking system. I think it was Oliver Wyman's numbers, not mine, when
We all know people with credit cards and have severe credit issues. What he's saying right now is he wants you to have he wants to make it easier for you to get credit. That's what he's saying.
finish the regulatory changes that we've announced, it'll be 2.5 trillion more in lending capacity from the banks. So I think that private credit, I almost think of it as a first loss tranche, that it's investors, not.
And so you don't think it's connected back into the banking system more broadly?
I think it could be connected back into the banking system, but I think that there is a large buffer there. I have a different worry about private credit than other people do. My worry is that in a downturn, it could be very pro-cyclical. That because it is financed by investors, if there was some kind of financial instability, if there was a downturn in the economy, Treasury through the regulators and the Fed, we can give window guidance to the regulators to loosen lending, the restrictions, the Fed can ease monetary conditions, maybe go to the balance sheet. My worry is that private credit becomes very pro-cyclical, that when you have investors in the investment business for 35 or 40 years, in your book.
Pro-cyclical. I've never heard that word before. That's typically what guys like this start doing. They start throwing some words out there and phrases out there that the normal person wouldn't understand, so that we're like kind of sitting there like, he keeps on talking, and then we hear the word pro-cyclical, and in our brains we're like, what pro-cyclical? What is that? And then we kind of like forget about the other stuff he's saying, which is it's just word salad. He's not.
1929, when you have investors as opposed to a government entity, they will always panic at the bottom.
Right. We're going to run out of time, and I have a couple of important questions for you. One is just about the relationship between the business community and the Trump administration. I want to give you an example of this. I want to get your thoughts on it because it's in the headlines right now, and it was something I had planned to ask David Ellison if he was going to be here on the stage. So David Ellison, as you know, is trying to buy Time Warner Discovery. There is news in the past week that he has greenlit a film called Rush Hour 4 by Brett Ratner because the president effectively suggested or said, this is one of my favorite films and I want to do this for Brett.
Nobody
and so now
wants
he is doing
that.
This, and people
Nobody
look at this and think
wants
that this is an
Rush Hour
example
4.
of a
That's
company
not going to be
trying
good.
to placate, that the president
There's
is trying
no
to push
way.
him, and they are trying to placate the president. What do you think of that?
Not much. That a transaction.
Yeah,
of
he
that
loves
size would be
he loves corruption.
But do you think it's appropriate for the president to be asking them to do something like that? And is it appropriate for a company to be doing something on the other end to placate the president?
I don't know. Is the Obama's contract with Netflix, is that appropriate?
My understanding is that came after he was the president of the United States. And that's the distinction, because these are things that are going to be in front of the president and the administration.
Okay, so for the first son to have a contract with a Ukraine energy.
Well, and Don Jr. has a relationship, I don't know where Shane is, at Polymarket and with Kalshi. And so it's very complicated. I mean, I'm curious how you...
Wow. Dude, Andrew Ross Sorkin right now has just gone up in my book, and wow, I'm very impressed. He knows what Bessent's going to say.
Think about these things.
These things are very complicated, and I think
they're not complicated. You're the president, dog. You're not supposed to be doing stuff like that, and you know this, and you're trying to justify it right now. And your gotchas got smashed. Like that was beautiful.
That it is like, if you want to start pulling at every thread, then let's start pulling at every thread of where Chuck Schumer's children work.
No.
Start pulling at every thread.
We're talking about the president right now. We're talking about your boss.
But you appreciate that there's a large swath of the public that looks at these relationships and says that this is different. And by the way, I had somebody who's a big supporter of the president actually say it just happens now out in the open. His argument was this used to happen privately all the time. The president is just more explicit about it. Here, that's the sympathetic view.
Yeah, look, I think that is completely the offsides. That the president could have said, I think it'd be a great movie. I have no idea. I wasn't there. Right, but Andrew,
but do you think the president should be weighing in on a transaction like that? I guess is the question.
Sorry,
should the president be weighing in?
Well, but you're not saying that he weighed in.
He hasn't yet.
Well, you aren't saying whether he's weighed in on Paramount, Warner Brothers.
What I'm suggesting.
You're saying he could? Let's go back to the word
yes,
could.
We're back to could.
We're back to could.
But that's why, arguably, look, my understanding is Paramount passed on making that film originally. So one of the reasons that you're seeing lots of companies do lots of things is to attempt in their own way to curry some favor with this administration.
Andrew, the defense primes spend $200 million a year on lobbying.
I understand, but
right.
And the question is this, do you put this in the lobbying context?
Sorry? Could be.
And you think that's, but I guess the question is, this is like a new, is this a new normal?
Andrew, there's no new normal. And, I can tell you that I actually don't read the New York Times anymore.
Oh, he's getting mad.
I do watch
Big
CNBC.
Mad.
But occasionally
nobody
people
reads
send
the
me
paper, like
articles,
hardly anybody.
and, there's just this fever swamp, and you're now a pop historian with 1929, and in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the New York Times is no longer the paper of record. You can't go. I read this article. Like President Trump is slowing down. President Trump's mental capacity. It is 100% fake. That he only called me twice at 2 in the morning.
Everyone else is fake and lying,
instead of 3 times.
except for Donald
You're saying he
Trump.
called you. I believe that he called you at 2 or 3 in the morning.
That whole narrative, and this is why people this is why young people are going to TikTok. This story, somebody sent it to me. Mike Johnson is beleaguered that he and his wife were so tired. They gave actually a very sympathetic and funny interview that somehow got twisted on the pages of the New York Times. It's just.
Let me say this though, just if I could. I think that what's happening here, and I will just defend that article for a moment. Not because I had nothing to do with it, but I think part of it is, if you remember, the media, including the Times and others, got criticized for not raising more issues around the health of Joe Biden. You remember this? And by the way, we did actually on this stage with the Vice President of the United States back then. But nonetheless, I think there was a lot of criticism about that. And so I think there's now a renewed sense that, given people's age, that we should be doing more in that space. I don't want to overstate it. It's not something I wrote. But I'm just trying to.
You had what was one of the greatest scandals of all time. That the coverage of the Biden administration, Joe Biden's diminished capacity, and the cover-up.
And that's why it's
story,
there to raise these questions.
Where was the New York Times? We just had a 3-hour cabinet meeting yesterday, Andrew. For 10 months, the Biden administration did not have a cabinet meeting. How are you going to invoke the 25th Amendment
Yeah,
if the
I covered
cabinet
that meeting.
secretaries
It was
never
weird.
see the president?
Like super weird. It's very North Korea.
I hear from people in the Treasury building that I see President Trump more in a day than my predecessor saw Joe Biden in half a year.
Don't care.
So,
irrelevant to what we're talking
I'm
about.
not taking the position one way or the other. I'm just saying I think it's a fair question to at least raise.
Well, look,
we're talking about corruption with Donald Trump and the government, and you're talking about how Biden was senile or whatever. Like, that's not, it has nothing to do with the question. You're just whataboutism, and you're just deflecting. This whole interview has been a giant whataboutism and deflection.
I think this is why you just wrote a book. People in 20, 30, 40, 50 years deserve to know what really happened, as opposed to, again, people send me these stories from the New York Times, and the headlines are not that different than the Daily Beast and the Huff Post.
Let's end this conversation on a subject that I think everybody on a bipartisan basis can probably agree upon, which is that yesterday you announced what is called the Trump accounts. And Michael Dell and his wife gave $6.25 billion to these accounts. And these accounts are going to go to children,
that was weird.
Starting in July, all across the country. What does that ultimately look like? And this is really one of the first sort of private-public efforts, because it's all going to be run by the Treasury. And I think your goal ultimately is to get philanthropists across the country to effectively give money through the Treasury to young Americans.
Yeah, I think that this is the beginning of a shareholder economy. If we look, 12% of Americans own 88% of equities. And then if you go down to the balance of 10% of Americans own 88% of the equities, and then the balance, if you go down to 50, the other 12%, and that's mostly through 401ks. What we're seeing now, we've seen this asset appreciation. In America, you either have assets or you don't, and I think that this is an opportunity for the American people, for everyone to have a stake in the system, for everyone to be a shareholder. So for the next 5 years, every child who is born in the U.S. will get a $1,000 account that will be invested in the S&P. They cannot access until they're 18, so they will see the power of compounding. We are going to have, via Treasury, a huge amount of financial literacy. And I think that, again, when you see that people have a stake in the system, they don't want to bring the system down. The second component of that is Americans are the most generous and giving people in the history of the world, and there has never been a vehicle, a for them to be able to give directly to American children. So this incredible gift that Susan and Michael Dell is giving, they're actually not doing it for the children who are going to be born. They're doing it retroactively. And the $6.25 billion is going to work out to about $250 per account for children from the past 10 years. But I believe that we are going to see this incredible outpouring into these accounts. And we now have the greatest fortunes in the history of America. And this is the chance that, because this had been talked about for a long time, and President Trump insisted on it being included in the One Big Beautiful Bill, that this is the opportunity for philanthropists, for foundations, and for corporates to contribute to all the American children. And you're going to be able to do it. You could do a school district, you could do a zip code, you could do a state. During the GFC, there was a panic among the billionaire class.
There will be no savings account from anybody. That $6 billion that the Dells, which was a very weird thing, donated to the Treasury, right? The Treasury, that's who they donated it to. Those kids are not going to see any of that money. Mark my words. This will be another shit stain on the administration. This savings account thing.
Going to come at them with pitchforks. So they did the Giving Pledge. And the Giving Pledge, while well-intentioned, was very amorphous. And now this is concrete. This is Michael and Susan saying $6.25 billion. And I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see people adopt states. I think we're going to see the school districts, and that children and families are going to be able to check on their phone that this is my piece of the American dream.
Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you. We are out of time. I could talk to you for a much longer time, and there's so many more questions, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Okay. But that was what a great interview. That was very entertaining. Andrew Ross Sorkin from CNBC. Wow, that guy has really gone up a lot, in my book for sure. Like his pushback on the Scott Bessent lies and manipulation was just priceless. Like it really was. Like, for example, when he said that, when Bessent was saying that inflation is 50 points worse in blue states as opposed to red states, he backed it up with facts right out of the gate. Wow, listen to Bessent talk. I lose all hope. Like, I know if this guy's in charge, if this guy's making decisions, which really he's not making any decisions. Donald Trump is making all the decisions. Let's all be real on that one. That the economy is not going to get better, and since we're already in a downward direction with the economy, that it's only going to get worse. Like this guy he's not incompetent, but he's like in a very tough spot where he has to defend the indefensible, and it's going poorly. And watching this guy squirm is just one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. Scott Bessent, we'll be watching for you, man. You got a tough job ahead of you, and man, we'll watch the economy. Hopefully, it doesn't get too much worse before Trump's out of there. But man, we got a long ways to go. We'll keep checked in, guys. Catch you later. Like, share, subscribe, so I can keep on doing this. Thanks, guys.